My name is Matt Hamilton. I'm a developer advocate on the FVM team. And JV?
Yeah, hey everybody. My name is Jonathan Victor, also go by JV, and I'm one of the ecosystem leads at Protocol Labs.
Cool. If we can, the next slide here. So there's a QR code here. I don't know if JV needs to move out of the way. But if anybody wants to ask any questions, so we're going to be talking about Web3 and kind of the role of FVM within that and what it enables. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, then scan that QR code. It'll take you to a Slido form, and you can put the questions in there. And if we have some time as we go through, we'll answer those too. So that's the audience participation part, right? So, okay.
Yeah, well, maybe just to kick it off. So I guess today we're going to be talking about the FVM and how it unlocks value for the Web3 economy. Maybe just to start, I guess, Matt, how do you think about the FVM versus other L1s? How do they complement each other, the pair? How do you think about it?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think one of the main things to note is that Filecoin is not really, like, competitive, at least not competitive in a bad way, against other blockchains, right? It's complementary to a lot of other blockchains. So, yes, you can run now with FVM and FEVM, you can run smart contracts on here that you could port over from, say, other EVM blockchains. But we think that the real value is that you can use them alongside the rest of the Web3 world, right? You don't have to necessarily sort of pick and choose. One of the great things with Filecoin, historically, is it has been used by a lot of other projects, right? So that's I think that's one of the main things there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting features is Filecoin as an economy is building out all of these real world services. So storage is the first service that we have. We'll have the retrieval markets for distribution. We'll have transformation with all the computer for data networking that's going on. And so the interesting thing is as a category expansion of what is possible in Web3, the FVM is just now saying anyone can trigger from other ecosystems or inside of the Filecoin ecosystem these services that can now be rendered in the real world. So hopefully from what will people do with these composable building blocks? It's not just saying inside of Filecoin's economy we have these services. It's also asking the question inside of the Solana ecosystem, what would you do if you could use DeFi there to fund activities inside of the Filecoin ecosystem to go do things in the real world like distributing content? Maybe to poke you a little bit, what do you see as some of those use cases?
So, I mean, one area that we've seen a lot is, Filecoin is a collection of services, right? You've possibly seen Wambanet's kind of master plan for Filecoin, and that is to store data. That's the first bit is basically build the world's largest decentralized storage network, and we're very well on the way. Well, we've done that, right? It is the largest storage network, decentralized storage network. Then store humanity's data, then add things like compute and the ability to manipulate that data on. And that's the area that we're at now, I think, in enabling these services to manipulate the data. So things like AI, for example, kind of compute at the edge. There's another project within Protocol Labs called Bacalhau, which is part of the Compute Over Data project. And, that offers some really interesting use cases when combined with the FVM, because you can do that processing of data kind of out on the edge of the network, but then you have a smart contract system to handle things like orchestration of those jobs, payment of those jobs, storing proofs that those jobs have been run, for example. So that's, I think, a big aspect of it.
100%. One way I think about it is, so Filecoin, you could think of there being data services. So storage is a data service, retrieval, computation. Those are things that you want to be able to trigger those actions to happen from the storage providers, from retrieval nodes, from people who are doing transformations. But also related to that is how do you do the payment for those services? So when we think about even just the capital services on the network, once you have programmability of value, you can start saying I want to offer, and the example Sarah gave, a bounty to someone if they're willing to go store my data. Or if I want to give a loan to a storage provider to say, hey, I will give you a cheaper cost of capital if you store my DAO's data, as an example. So you can start using the financial primitives to help accelerate and also enable some of the data services that are also happening, but just keeping those two much more tightly coupled together.
Yeah, and making, like you say, capital, the capital more efficient, right? The usage of capital more efficient. So storage providers need to stake fill in order to provide their services as collateral. So the ability to be able to offer loans markets now to that, and being able to borrow near instantly fill collateral liquidity in order to enter the market is really powerful. Because at the moment, yes, there's some loan providers and lending services, but they are permissions, kind of traditional style services, whereas now moving it onto kind of more of a DeFi type approach using smart contracts. You can even have things like, flash loans where a storage provider can actually borrow the fill needed specifically in, real time for the deal that they're about to take on, which is pretty cool. So, JB, how do you see like Filecoin impacting Web3 in general?
Yeah, I mean, so I sort of touched on this before. I think like one of the things that I like to think about is inside of Web3, there's so many people doing interesting things so like take gaming as an example. So you have teams that are building their own game economies and like they're figuring out how to balance that, all of that good stuff. Separately, they're also contracting a bunch of services outside in the real world where it's like, okay, we're going to have some amount of our tokens that we're selling, whether it's the dev team or someone else, in order to like go fund like the actual distribution of their content, the servers that like these games are running on. I think one of the fascinating ideas, once you set up these like protocol native like loops, is it means you can actually move away from saying like, okay, we need someone who's running this infrastructure. This requires like retrieval markets, compute and all to be like fully rolled out. But you could imagine basically having a game economy that's like balanced appropriately and so on, but having parts of that like flow out to land in a smart contract that just then funds the perpetual distribution of the content. So like, so long as there's people playing the game, so long as the economy is robust, you also have a self-funding mechanism for how the actual distribution of those assets are like perpetually like funded. I think the part that gets interesting is that it doesn't require any individual party to be there to make sure that these assets are still like alive, that the game is still running. It just requires the game to have like users for the game to actually be built in a sustainable and sound way, which I think we're like a little bit away from that actually be reality, but I think it sort of like sparks the imagination of like, what does this actually mean? Like, why is permissionless payment rails actually interesting? It's like you can now further segment like the physical and the digital worlds, where so long as the digital economies are actually robust, you can now contract with like the real world services that you will need in order to like persist the assets.
And I mean, one of the questions that we've just had come in is regarding like comparing the cost between like S3, Amazon S3 and Filecoin. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and maybe about how like Filecoin, and talking about like the economy within Filecoin and keeping value within the Web3 world?
Yeah, I mean, like, so Filecoin today is like much more like cold verifiable storage. Though once you have smart contracts, you can start layering other services on top. You have all of these like storage providers who have massive amounts of like hardware, these footprints. You could easily build a hot storage layer that sits on top and just settles into the cold storage layer of Filecoin. And so you can start having trade-offs between like what is the performance that you want and the verifiability that you want of the service, and seamlessly move up and down these like layers. You can even go even further out where it's like I have a retrieval network where it's like super hot cached and the thing that I'm looking for is like very, very low latency. And so you can really build a service that goes up and down the spectrum of like what sort of verifiability guarantees do you want, as well as like what sort of performance. The reason this becomes interesting is when you're doing things through these like incentivized networks, you get the aggregation of the hardware of like many different providers. It's not like you're single sourcing it from one specific company who eventually will then jack up the bandwidth rates and like make it really expensive for you to run your application. When you're doing it on these open interfaces, you could work with a single or even multiple storage providers, but if you need to port to another one in the future, or for some reason it makes sense to move into specific geographies, you're not re-architecting your app. Everything is still content addressing. You're just changing like some parameters maybe in your smart contract and how things are distributed to move it to whatever regions make sense.
Yeah, and talking about as well that at the moment, a lot of the value is moving out of Web3 and going into some of these large centralized storage providers like Amazon and S3. And so it's quite interesting that, for certain classes of storage, we'll be able to keep that like value within the Web3 economy, I think, which has, I think, a lot of value as well to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting just thinking of like Filecoin as like one island economy, Ethereum as another island economy, Solana as another island economy. And like the thing that we are able to do now is just like have more trade between these economies. Like we have a real service that we can offer. Those economies have their own DeFi ecosystems. You look at like Ethereum with like the real world assets and MakerDAO, and like there's opportunities to build things that span both chains to say like, if I would like to use Ethereum's DeFi to fund my storage or my like applications in Filecoin, once you have a cross-chain bridge, it's just about sending a message and like moving funds. But it's really just saying like we can actually like use the power of Web3's native like economies to support each other.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I guess like maybe to sort of like dovetail off of that. So like we talked a little bit about some of the other services that are coming online with retrieval and compute. And I'm curious how you see like as Filecoin incrementally adds more and more, how that sort of helps evolve Web3 overall.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the analogies is with like the open source world, right? And, you know, open source has enabled so many other services to be built, you know, much more frictionlessly on, you know, on top of other services. And I see, you know, Filecoin allowing a similar kind of thing, especially now with the FVM, that you can build on top of it permissionlessly and build a lot on top there. So I think that's an area that's certainly gonna sort of show up there. And as well as looking at things like gaming and metaverses as well, right? The idea that you can actually have these economies within, say, games, within metaverses, actually sort of self-fund their own storage of assets, I think is really interesting. So taking an example like Gala Games and, you know, actually the tokens within there, as well as being used to like fund items within the game, can actually then be used to actually fund the storage itself, right? I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things I think that's kind of interesting is like, so when people think of Web3, there's like a very narrow set of things that even outside of this community, if you like go to just an average conference, it'll be like, there's like a DeFi track, there's an NFT track, there's like, I don't know, like maybe gaming is another one, but like it's like a pretty limited set. And I think when we think about like, how do we do category expansion of like, who is a Web3 developer? Once we start unlocking like storage, retrieval, compute, these are just generic services that people use on the web. So we were talking about like open science is another one where like this is separate from like, I think there's like a lot of like philosophical alignment between the open science community and like Web3 and the values that we have. But I think it's like we actually can solve some of the real problems that they do have, given like science data is massive. Like I think NASA had an RFC like that closed on Tuesday or last Tuesday for storing an exabyte of their data and then figuring out how to build open science tooling on top. Like there is no other way of doing that outside of the cloud today other than Filecoin, which is like kind of crazy if we think about like this is the opportunity to say like when we think about like how do we actually support humanity's information, how do we help like compound the tooling that science has, we can have verifiability and reproducibility of results if we have content hashes. We can keep costs low if it's literally like the marginal provider for storing that data. If universities can also host copies locally and use like pinning an IPFS and seamlessly moving between IPFS and Filecoin.
And a lot of that data, you know, legally has to be public as well. I was talking to a hardware storage vendor earlier, and they were talking about, you know, some of their clients, these big universities buying, you know, trucks full of hard drives for storage, but they're actually mandated by law to make a lot of this data publicly available. So yes, they've got like the storage, but they don't have the ability to really make it available and distribute it. And I think that's a key area within DeSci and within Filecoin. And again, as you touched about, it's the verifiability, right? So if you think about, you get a scientific paper and they might outline the process they went through. They may even link to like the algorithms they've run. They might link to say a GitHub, you know, repository with the actual code in that they've run. But quite often they don't have a link to the data, the inputs that they've put in to come up with the results they've come up with. And that's normally because the data is just so large. So to be able to store it on Filecoin and then have, you know, a CID, a content ID that's verifiable, you know that the data that you're ingesting and running into that algorithm is the exact same data that was ingested and run into the algorithm when the paper was written. And that's a huge thing to be able to do.
Definitely. Do you want to take some questions? Or
yeah. So question here. Another question we've got is, there's a few more that have just come in. How can Web2 companies benefit from FVM? What do you think about that?
I guess it depends on the Web2 company.
Exactly.
Like, I think so one of the things that's really cool is I think Filecoin just gives a lot of like flexibility to what people, or the FVM specifically, around like what people will build. So if you are a data center company in Web2, I think like hopefully this reduces the barrier to entry if you were trying to like build a Filecoin like storage provider business. Once you have like capital markets, it's not even the case that like you have to necessarily go out and buy a ton of Filecoin. There will be DeFi protocols that you can tap to be able to like permissionlessly get access to capital in order to grow your business. When you think of like different types of services, like if you are a business that is in charge of like storing sensitive assets, so like some folks have to keep records of data for some period of time, like you could have a smart contract that shows a verifiable audit trail where you don't have to take on the liability. There's actually a team that's sort of doing this with NFTs where like they're a shipping company, or they're like they have NFTs that like are of the bill of lading, and they're required to keep the data around for like 10 years. It's like, cool. Once you have verifiable proofs and you have smart contracts, you can actually just like automate that process where you don't have to be the single point of failure holding onto this data and hoping that like nothing goes wrong. Like you can have an audit trail where it shows that this data was always persisted in whatever way it was necessary.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be like a blended approach to the storage as well. So we're going to no doubt start to see like these intermediate layers that will start. I mean, I know that I think there's one already out there that offers like an S3 compatible API that is backed up in the end by IPFS, right? And so doing a similar thing with Filecoin, you'd be able to move your storage from, say, like the centralized existing providers over. So even if like the rest of your stack is very kind of Web 2-ish, you could still take advantage of the storage, especially for, like you say, cold storage kind of in the background there. There's a question here, sort of going into some more technical ones, about is there a collection of snippets of code around FVM that people could use and copy and paste from? Well, there's a project. We've got the Hard Hat Starter Kit, and so if you Google FVM Hard Hat Starter Kit, you'll probably get it. Created by my colleague Zach, and I think Sarah might have shown it in the previous talk. So if you go there, there's some examples there as well, and there's also a awesome FVM repository as well that has a link to a whole bunch of stuff in there as well. So we can find some other bits and pieces in there. So yeah, compare and contrast Bacalhau and FVM. Both promise compute over data, right?
So the FVM, I think the better way of thinking of it is compute over state. So like on the Filecoin blockchain, you have a state of like storage providers are posting proofs. You can see like who is actually submitting those. You can see like who's getting slashed. It gives you information about like the state of the world. Bacalhau is saying like, how do I do computation over data? So not the things that are on the blockchain necessarily, but like all the stuff that's stored on the Filecoin network. So with the storage providers that is being verified on chain. So as an example, it would be the difference between saying like, is my climate data set healthy? If not, replicate. That's an FVM problem. Versus I would like to run a transformation to say like, what is the latitude and longitude of the cities that like had a rainfall of more than whatever? And that's like a Bacalhau problem.
And those two are, there's a project that the Bacalhau team have created called Project Lilypad. It was originally called Project Frog. You might see some references to that, but it's now called Project Lilypad. And that is a combination of FVM and Bacalhau. So in that particular case, they're actually using, and Molly talked about this earlier, they're actually running the stable diffusion machine learning algorithm on Bacalhau. So you can give it a text prompt and it'll give you an image back. But they're then orchestrating that using smart contracts on FVM. And eventually they're looking at doing things like payment via FVM. So you can use the smart contracts to deal with, holding collateral whilst the job is being run and then releasing the collateral on proof that the job has been run, for example. So that's quite an interesting one. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, actually. We've got one more? Okay. Let's see here. Okay, the FVM lets us build a bunch of DeFi solutions to be built on Filecoin. Do you expect a high growth in interest from the average DeFi Ethereum user in the Filecoin ecosystem?
I think that's like a maybe. So here's, I think, the reasons why yes, and then maybe the reasons why no. The reasons why yes is like, I think unlike other ecosystems, Filecoin has like an economic loop that's not just like there is like a real thing. Like storage providers need capital. There's like thousands of businesses anchored to that Filecoin network who are looking for capital. So if you were a DeFi builder, there's a lot of opportunities there. I think equally though, there's other things that maybe are like trade-offs. And I would also say things like data DAOs will look probably more like pension funds. They're just giant standing pools of capital funding data sets. Those will be natural consumers of DeFi as well. So like if you are a DeFi builder, the fact that we have this orthogonal capital flow loop that's tied to these services that are being rendered should hopefully be exciting to you. I think the reasons why it's probably going to be different from what people expect in Ethereum is like Filecoin has a block time of like 30 seconds. So I think like the experience and the UX of like building DeFi is going to look probably pretty different from what people normally are thinking of. But it's really going to be, what I imagine at least, is like around what are the services that people are procuring on the network and how do you build financialization around that to unlock capital efficiency?
Yeah. And the FVM allows you to then build additional like layer 2s on top of the Filecoin blockchain. So in the same way you've got layer 2s on Ethereum, you could build those on top using FVM as well. So you might have a layer 2 that's specifically focused on privacy or particularly focused on performance or zero knowledge proofs or something like that. So I think that's quite a bit. I think we're coming up to we're out of time now. But thank you very much, everybody. And thanks a lot, JV. It was great chatting.